Welcome to History Files, where we uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. September 26th, 1346. The battlefield at Crécy, France. A 16-year-old prince stands surrounded by 30,000 French corpses. He's just commanded his first battle. When the fighting was fiercest, his father, King Edward III of England, refused to send reinforcements, declaring, "Let the boy win his spurs." The boy had done more than that. He'd annihilated the flower of French chivalry. He'd stood calm as blind King John of Bohemia charged to certain death. He'd watched French knights trample their own crossbowmen in panic. As Europe's most powerful army dissolved in a bloody chaos, this golden prince in black armor was knighted on the battlefield. Nobles gathered around him, calling him the perfect embodiment of chivalry, the ideal Christian knight. No one could have imagined that this shining hero would become medieval Europe's most notorious killer. This is the story of Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, the man who invented total war 5 centuries before the term existed, who turned systematic terrorism into military science, who created national hatred through calculated brutality, and who died in agony, his body rotting from the inside, haunted by visions of the thousands he'd massacred. This is the story of how the perfect knight became the perfect monster. Edward of Woodstock was born on June 15, 1330, in the royal palace at Woodstock, Oxfordshire. He was everything medieval society idealized in a warrior prince. Tall, over 6 feet, exceptional for the era. Handsome, with the golden hair and striking features of the Plantagenet dynasty. Educated in languages, literature, and the arts of war. Trained from childhood to lead armies and inspire men. He was generous to his followers, showering them with gifts and honors. He was supposedly merciful to defeated enemies, at least those who could pay ransom. He dressed magnificently, wore the finest armor, and carried himself with royal dignity. Chroniclers praise his courtesy, his religious devotion, his perfect adherence to chivalric codes. He founded religious chapels. He gave alms to the poor. He wore an ostrich feather badge, still the symbol of the Prince of Wales today, with the humble motto, Ich dien, I serve. After capturing King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, Edward famously served the French king dinner personally. He claimed he wasn't worthy to sit at the same table as royalty, even though he had defeated and captured that very king. French nobles who surrendered to him initially spoke of his honor and proper treatment. He was, by every standard of his age, the perfect Christian knight. But something darker lurked beneath the shining armor. Even at Crécy, observers noted how young Edward watched French nobles drowning in their own blood with peculiar satisfaction. How his eyes followed the fleeing soldiers not with pity, but with something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. And when he took his first independent command in 1355, the world would discover what that darkness truly meant. The campaign of 1355 was Edward's opportunity to prove himself as an independent commander. His father gave him control of English forces in Aquitaine. The English held territories in southwestern France, with orders to raid French lands and disrupt their economy. What Edward unleashed went far beyond typical medieval raiding. He developed what he called the chevauchée, a French term meaning raid or cavalry charge. But Edward's chevauchée was something medieval Europe had never seen before. It was systematic terrorism disguised as military strategy. The idea was simple and utterly brutal. Destroy everything that could support life. Burn crops before they could be harvested. Poison wells with animal carcasses and human corpses. Slaughter livestock, not to feed your army, but to ensure the enemy couldn't feed theirs. Destroy mills so grain couldn't be ground into flour. Burn churches to break morale and eliminate sanctuary. Level entire towns. Kill anyone who couldn't be ransomed. Make the land so desolate that it couldn't support armies, governments, or even basic civilization. It was total war 5 centuries before the term was invented. The 1355 Grande Chevauchée carved a 900-mile path of absolute destruction across southern France. Starting from Bordeaux in October, the Black Prince's army swept east, then south, then west in a massive arc of devastation. Over 500 towns and villages were destroyed. The complete annihilation of Carcassonne's lower town stands out. one of medieval France's most prosperous cities, burned so thoroughly it never recovered its medieval glory. Edward's explicit orders to his commanders were clear: burn and destroy everything. Soldiers were paid bonuses for the most thorough destruction. Competitions were held to see which companies could level towns fastest. Churches were specifically targeted, not for their wealth, though that was taken, but to break French morale and eliminate places of sanctuary. Monks and priests were tortured to reveal hidden valuables, then killed anyway. Old men who couldn't flee were burned alive in their homes. Women and children were driven into churches, which were then set ablaze. The psychological impact was devastating. French peasants began believing the English were demons sent by God to punish them for unknown sins. Some fell to their knees and prayed as Edward's soldiers approached, begging for mercy that never came. The Black Prince was refining terror into military science. Edward's tactics evolved into something even more horrifying than simple destruction. He was designing systematic psychological warfare. He would leave one survivor from each village, usually a child, to run to the next settlement and describe what was coming. The terror that preceded his army was as effective as the army itself. Towns would surrender without resistance just from stories. He displayed mutilated bodies along roads and artistic arrangements. Heads on pikes, forming arrows, pointing toward his next target. Bodies arranged in patterns that could be seen from a distance, announcing his approach like grotesque heralds. Wells were poisoned with human corpses and dead animals, ensuring that even after his army passed, death would linger. Communities that tried to return to their destroyed homes would die from contaminated water, keeping the land empty for months. One French chronicler, Jean de Venette, wrote, "The English came not as warriors, but as harvesters of death, leaving nothing but crows and wolves to inhabit what were once prosperous lands. For 7 years after their passing, no birds sang." It's an extraordinary claim, but archaeological evidence suggests it was an exaggeration. The regions Edward devastated showed massive ecological damage. Agricultural records indicate complete collapse of farming. Population surveys show entire parishes emptied. The Black Prince had created artificial wastelands in the heart of France. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19th, 1356, cemented the Black Prince's military reputation while revealing his true nature. Outnumbered 2-1, Edward commanded perhaps 8,000 men against King John II's 16,000. The Black Prince destroyed the French army through brilliant defensive tactics. Using the terrain, his longbowmen, and disciplined men-at-arms, he killed thousands of French soldiers and captured King John II himself. The battle was a masterpiece of military tactics, but the aftermath showed Edward's evolving cruelty. While he treated King John with elaborate courtesy, for propaganda purposes, to show English nobility and generosity, common French soldiers were systematically executed. Those who couldn't pay ransom were blinded and released to become burdens on French society. They would wander the roads as living warnings of English power, unable to work, dependent on charity, constant reminders of defeat. The contrast between his treatment of valuable nobles and worthless commoners exposed the lie of chivalric honor. It only applied to those who could pay. Everyone else was disposable. Ransoms from Poitiers made Edward and his followers fantastically wealthy. King John's ransom alone was 3 million gold crowns, roughly equivalent to twice France's annual revenue. Individual knights who captured nobles became rich for life. But for every noble who bought his freedom, dozens of common soldiers died in ditches, their bodies left for animals. In 1367, the Black Prince intervened in the Castilian Civil War, a succession dispute in Spain between King Pedro the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Edward backed Pedro, leading an English army across the Pyrenees. At the Battle of Najera on April 3, 1367, Edward won another brilliant tactical victory. But what followed the battle revealed new depths of depravity. Edward watched approvingly as Pedro murdered his own brother Henry with a dagger, stabbing him repeatedly in a royal tent, while Edward's guards prevented intervention. Then came the massacre of prisoners. 7,000 men who had surrendered were systematically executed over 3 days. Spanish chronicles describe rivers running red for a week. Bodies were piled and burned, creating pyres visible for miles. Edward supervised the executions personally, ordering specific methods for different classes of prisoners. Nobles were beheaded. Knights had their throats cut. Common soldiers were simply hacked to pieces. But Spain would have its revenge. During the campaign, Edward contracted what historians believe was dysentery, possibly complicated by cancer or another wasting disease. It would spend the next 9 years slowly rotting him from the inside. Many contemporaries saw it as divine punishment for his crimes in God's own kingdom of Castile. The disease would transform Edward from feared warrior into a living corpse, carried on a litter, unable to stand, his body decaying while he still lived. As Prince of Aquitaine from 1362 to 1371, Edward transformed from military terrorist to economic vampire. He imposed crushing taxes that drove noble families into poverty. The hearth tax, a tax on every fireplace, was so burdensome that entire villages were abandoned. Families bricked up fireplaces to avoid the tax, freezing through winters rather than pay. Edward sold safe passages to merchants, then had them robbed by bandits who were actually his own soldiers in disguise. The soldiers would split the plunder with the prince. Towns were forced to pay protection money or face destruction. It was a massive extortion racket disguised as governance. When Aquitanian nobles finally rebelled in 1368, they cited not just the taxes, but the complete breakdown of law and justice under Edward's rule. The perfect knight had become a perfect extortionist, squeezing his subjects until they had nothing left to give. After Spain, the Black Prince was never the same physically. The illness that struck him was described by contemporaries as a great sickness and rotting of the blood. He couldn't ride a horse, instead being carried everywhere in a litter like a corpse. His skin turned yellow and black in patches. He suffered constant fever and bloody flux, severe dysentery with blood in his stool. He couldn't eat solid food. His teeth fell out. Some days he couldn't even stand. Other days he couldn't speak coherently. He suffered hallucinations, claiming to see ghosts. Yet the sickness seemed to make him crueler, as if his rotting body was revealing his rotting soul. He ordered executions from his sickbed. He planned massacres while fevered. He signed death warrants when he could barely hold a quill. His own knights began avoiding him, claiming his presence brought bad luck. The disease had turned the perfect knight into a grotesque horror, but it hadn't diminished his capacity for atrocity. The massacre of Limoges in September 1370 destroyed whatever remained of the Black Prince's reputation. Limoges was a wealthy city in central France that had been under English control. But in August 1370, the Bishop of Limoges, who had been Edward's friend, negotiated the city's surrender to French forces. Edward took it personally. It was betrayal by someone he trusted, and he would make Limoges pay in blood. After a 6-month siege that starved the population into eating rats, leather, and eventually each other, English miners tunneled under the walls. On September 19th, 1370, the walls collapsed and English soldiers poured into the city. Edward's orders were explicit and horrifying. Kill every living soul. 3,000 civilians, men, women, children, priests, everyone, were systematically butchered over the course of several hours. Soldiers went house to house with axes and swords. They dragged families into the streets and executed them. Babies were thrown down wells. Pregnant women were cut open. The elderly were burned alive. Priests were killed at altars. The Bishop of Limoges himself crawled to Edward's litter, begging for mercy on his knees. This man who had been Edward's friend, who had hosted him at feasts, who had blessed his campaigns. The prince, too sick to stand but not too sick to hate, refused. He watched the bishop beg, then ordered him dragged away and killed. Jean Froissart, the great French chronicler who had previously praised the Black Prince's chivalry.
It was a great pity to see the men, women, and children who knelt before the prince, crying for mercy. But he was so inflamed with anger that he listened to no one. More than 3,000 were put to the sword. God have mercy on their souls, for they were true martyrs. Even English knights were horrified. Some refused to participate and left Edward's service. Others carried out the orders, but later testified they had nightmares for years. Sir John Chandos, Edward's closest military companion, reportedly said, "This is not war. This is murder." He left the sack early and never spoke to Edward with the same warmth again. The French began calling Edward La Terreur de Dieu, the terror of God, believing he was divine punishment made flesh for humanity's sins. Modern estimates suggest the 3,000 killed at Limoges represented nearly the entire civilian population. Archaeological excavations in the 1960s uncovered mass graves with evidence of systematic violence against non-combatants. The massacre had no military purpose. Limoges had already fallen. The population was starving and harmless. Edward simply wanted revenge for what he saw as betrayal. It was murder for its own sake, ordered by a dying man who wanted the world to suffer as he suffered. The Black Prince's methods, horrific as they were, revolutionized medieval warfare. He proved that chivalry was a luxury that victory couldn't afford. His chevauchée showed that economic destruction was more effective than battlefield victories. His use of terror as a weapon taught future commanders that breaking enemy morale was easier than breaking their armies. He turned war from a noble sport into systematic destruction. The age of gallant knights meeting in honorable combat died with his campaigns. In its place rose the age of professional soldiers, total war, and the understanding that in war there were no innocents, only targets. Throughout his descent into monstrosity, the Black Prince maintained elaborate religious observances. And here we confront one of the most disturbing aspects of his character: his apparent inability to see any contradiction between piety and atrocity. He founded chantry chapels where monks would pray for his soul in perpetuity. He made pilgrimages to shrines, always leaving generous donations. Before each massacre, he heard Massachusetts. After each atrocity, he confessed and received absolution. He carried religious relics into battle, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, and claimed his victories were God's will. This wasn't seen as hypocrisy in medieval times, but as proper Christian warfare, killing the body to save the soul. Destroying heretics and God's enemies was holy work. Yet even by medieval standards, Edward's combination of piety and cruelty was extreme. He would pray while ordering executions, take communion before commanding massacres. He once stopped a sack to observe a feast day, had mass said, then resumed the killing. He built a chapel at Canterbury specifically to house his tomb, decorating it with images of his victories. The prince surrounded himself with men who shared his evolving brutality. His Welsh longbowmen were notorious for their cruelty, often blinding prisoners by shooting arrows into their eyes for sport. They would make bets on who could shoot out both eyes from the greatest distance. His Gascon mercenaries, led by men like Jean de Grailly, were given free rein to pillage and murder. These weren't noble knights, but professional killers who saw war as business and terror as a tool. The prince protected them from all criticism, even when they raped nuns or burned pilgrims alive. When complaints reached him about his soldiers' behavior, he would dismiss them, saying, "War is war." He created a military culture where the worst atrocities were not just permitted, but rewarded. The more brutal the soldier, the higher he rose in the prince's service. The most effective killers received the best plunder, the highest honors, the richest ransoms. It was a culture that attracted psychopaths and sadists, men who enjoyed violence for its own sake. And Edward was their perfect commander. By 1371, the Black Prince's body was failing completely. The disease that had struck him in Spain had progressed from debilitating to devastating. He couldn't walk. He couldn't ride. He could barely sit up. His skin was covered in lesions. His flesh was rotting on his bones. The stench of decay surrounded him constantly. His own attendants had to wrap cloths soaked in perfume around their faces to approach him. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his cruelty intensified. He ordered executions from his litter. He planned campaigns he could no longer lead. He dictated letters threatening destruction to towns that defied him, even though he lacked the strength to carry out those threats. His temper became uncontrollable. He once had a servant beaten to death for spilling wine on his coverlet. Another attendant was hanged for bringing news of a French victory. He couldn't sleep without massive doses of poppy wine, medieval opium, and even then, he woke screaming. Even his own family avoided him. His father, King Edward III, visited rarely and stayed briefly. His wife, Joan of Kent, kept separate chambers and made excuses to be elsewhere. His surviving brothers found reasons to leave court when Edward was present. He had become too horrible to look at, too dangerous to be near. The perfect knight had become a monster in every sense. The prince's brutality had ultimately destroyed everything he fought to win. The Aquitanian nobles who had initially welcomed English rule were driven to rebellion by his tyranny. They appealed to the French king, Charles V, offering to submit to French authority if he would protect them from English oppression. Town after town defected back to France, preferring French law to English terror. Bordeaux remained loyal, but it became an isolated English outpost in hostile territory. By 1371, almost all the territories won over decades of war were lost. The prince, now too sick to fight, could only watch from his litter as his life's work crumbled. He tried one last campaign, attempting to besiege and burn Montpellier with its entire population inside. But his army refused. Even hardened soldiers balked at the scale of the atrocity he planned. The campaign fell apart before it began. In 1371, Edward resigned as Prince of Aquitaine in humiliation. He was carried back to England on a ship, lying on a bed in the hold, weeping with rage and fever. The man who had conquered France couldn't hold what he'd won. All the destroyed cities, all the massacred civilians, all the calculated terror. It had achieved nothing permanent. Worse, it had created something Edward never anticipated: French nationalism. Before Edward, wars were largely conflicts between nobles, with peasants as incidental victims. Most common people didn't care which noble ruled them. They paid taxes and lived their lives regardless of who sat on distant thrones. Edward's systematic targeting of civilians changed that forever. He created national hatred. French peasants who had never cared about politics now despised the English with personal passion. They had seen their families killed, their homes burned, their lives destroyed by English soldiers. This hatred transcended class. Merchants, priests, nobles, and peasants united in their desire for revenge against England. Edward had inadvertently created French national identity through shared suffering. This emotional transformation would eventually drive the English from France entirely. When Joan of Arc rallied France in the 1420s, she built on the foundation of national trauma that Edward had created. French soldiers fought with a determination born of decades of accumulated rage. Edward won every battle, but created the conditions for England's ultimate defeat. The Black Prince's last years were a descent into physical and mental hell. By 1375, his body was essentially a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing. Wounds wouldn't heal. His hair had turned completely white. His teeth were gone. He could barely speak coherently. He suffered horrific hallucinations, claiming to see the ghosts of those he'd killed surrounding his bed. He would scream at them, ordering them away, threatening them with new tortures. His doctors could do nothing. Medieval medicine had no treatment for whatever was killing him. Likely some combination of dysentery, cancer, and systemic infection. On good days, he could sit up and dictate letters. Most were orders for executions, demands for money, or threats against those who had betrayed him. On bad days, he screamed about demons coming for his soul. He claimed he could feel himself rotting from the inside. He begged God for forgiveness one moment, and cursed his enemies for damnation the next. The Black Prince's son would pay for his father's sins. Richard of Bordeaux, the future Richard II, was born in 1367, the Black Prince's only surviving legitimate son. He inherited the throne in 1377 at age 10, after his grandfather Edward III died. Richard grew up haunted by his father's legacy. He knew the stories. He knew what his father had done, and he wanted desperately to be different. Richard tried to make peace with France, to end the endless wars his father had glorified. But the English nobles, grown rich on French plunder, addicted to the wealth that war provided, opposed him at every turn. Richard became increasingly erratic, paranoid, authoritarian. He saw plots everywhere. He executed or exiled nobles he suspected of disloyalty. He tried to centralize power, to break the nobility's military strength. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke led a rebellion. Richard was deposed, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and murdered, probably starved to death, at age 33. The direct line of the Black Prince ended with a murdered king. It was as if the very bloodline was cursed. French chroniclers saw divine justice in this end. The sins of the father visited upon the son. The Perfect Knight's dynasty died as violently as the thousands he had killed. On June 8, 1376, Trinity Sunday, the Black Prince died at Westminster Palace, age 45. His death was as horrible as his life had become. Witnesses described him alternating between begging God for forgiveness and cursing his enemies for damnation. He supposedly saw visions of massacre victims surrounding his bed, the children of Limoges, the soldiers of Nahara, the peasants of 100 burned villages. His final words, according to some accounts, were, "I have done evil. I know it. I know it." Though English chroniclers claimed he died peacefully after confession, receiving the last rites and asking forgiveness for his sins. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral with an elaborate funeral. His tomb effigy shows a perfect knight in shining armor. Handsome, noble, the ideal of chivalry. But that effigy was perhaps the greatest lie of all. The real Black Prince had died as he lived, in blood and horror. The Black Prince's campaigns left economic scars that lasted generations. The regions he devastated in the 1350s and 1360s still showed massive population decline in the 1420s, 70 years later. Agricultural production in southern France didn't recover to pre-war levels for over a century. The destruction of infrastructure, mills, bridges, irrigation systems, set back economic development by decades. Trade routes were abandoned. Entire industries destroyed. Currency systems collapsed. In pure economic terms, the cost of his victories exceeded any plunder gained. He had won battles, but destroyed the very wealth that made the territories worth fighting for. Medieval economists called it making a desert and calling it peace. Modern archaeology confirms the chronicler's accounts of the Black Prince's brutality. Excavations at sites along his campaign routes reveal layers of ash consistent with total destruction. Buildings burned so hot that stone foundations cracked. Entire town layers reduced to charcoal. Mass graves dating to the 1350s and 1370s show evidence of violence against civilians. Women and children with sword wounds. Skulls showing execution-style killings. Blade marks on neck vertebrae. Bodies showing signs of torture before death. At Limoges, construction work in the 1960s uncovered a mass burial site with remains of approximately 300 individuals. Only 1/10 of the reported casualties, but all showing trauma consistent with massacre rather than battle. Coin hoards buried during his campaigns and never recovered suggest populations that fled or died before they could retrieve their hidden wealth. The physical evidence supports the darkest interpretations of his legacy. English historians immediately began rehabilitating the Black Prince's image after his death. Chronicles were edited to minimize atrocities and emphasize chivalric deeds. The massacre at Limoges was reduced from 3,000 victims to 300, then described as a military necessity after a legitimate siege. His economic extortion was reframed as efficient administration. The systematic destruction of French countryside became strategic brilliance. Victorian historians in the 19th century turned Edward into a romantic hero, the perfect medieval knight fighting for England's glory. They emphasized his victories, his supposed chivalry, his religious devotion. French sources describing his atrocities were dismissed as enemy propaganda or exaggeration. The chevauchées were described as normal medieval warfare. Limoges became a regrettable incident where discipline broke down. This whitewashing was so effective that even today, many English people remember the Black Prince as a hero rather than the war criminal he actually was. But the French never forgot. In regions he devastated, particularly around Limoges and Carcassonne, Edward is still remembered as Le Prince Noir, with all the sinister implications that name carries in French. Limoges has never forgotten its massacre. The cathedral has a memorial to the victims. Local museums display evidence of the destruction. Some families still claim descent from survivors. Carcassonne's museum has an entire section on the Black Prince's destruction of the medieval city. Archaeological evidence, contemporary accounts, economic records showing the city's decline. The split memory reflects how nations construct different histories from the same events. The perfect knight to some remains the perfect monster to others. The Black Prince's true legacy was the transformation of warfare from limited noble conflict to total war. His chevauchée strategy would be used for centuries. William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea in the American Civil War followed Edward's blueprint almost exactly. Destroy economic infrastructure, terrorize civilians, make the land unable to support enemy armies. His use of terror to break civilian morale became standard military doctrine. Modern armies call it strategic bombing or shock and awe, but the principle is identical. Make the cost of resistance so high that people surrender rather than endure. His economic warfare, destroying the enemy's ability to make war rather than just defeating their armies, predated modern strategic thinking by 500 years. Military academies still study his campaigns, though they focus on tactics rather than atrocities. He proved that in war, brutality worked better than honor, a lesson humanity has never forgotten. Today, the Black Prince exists in two completely different versions. In England, he's still often portrayed as a chivalric hero. Pubs, streets, and schools bear his name. His tomb at Canterbury Cathedral remains a tourist attraction where guides speak of his military genius while glossing over his atrocities. The Black Prince pub in London is one of the city's most popular. Schools teach about his victories at Crécy and Poitiers. The Prince of Wales still bears the ostrich feather badge Edward wore, with the motto, Ich Dien. In France, particularly in regions he devastated, he's remembered differently. Museums display the evidence. Memorials honor the victims. The name, Le Prince Noir, carries connotations of evil, of darkness, of terror. And perhaps that duality is his truest legacy, not as hero or monster, but as both. The perfect knight who was perfectly brutal, the pious Christian who massacred thousands, the chivalric prince who invented total war. Edward of Woodstock proved that in warfare, there is no separation between the man and the monster. The perfect knight was perfect precisely because he perfectly embodied war's essential brutality. He won every battle and lost everything that mattered. He killed thousands and died haunted by their ghosts. He built a reputation for chivalry on a foundation of corpses. The Black Prince wasn't an aberration. He was medieval warfare stripped of its romantic lies, showing the ugly truth beneath the shining armor. Thank you for watching History Files. If this deep dive into the dark side of medieval chivalry shocked you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Check out our other documentaries on forgotten moments that changed the world, including battles where the Black Prince won his early reputation. Remember, history isn't just about heroes and villains. Sometimes it's about understanding how heroes become villains, and how the same person can be both simultaneously. Until next time, keep exploring the files of history.